Every night, he stood at the kitchen counter and stirred something into my tea, believing with complete certainty that I was the one drinking it. He watched me lift the cup to my lips. He watched my eyes grow heavy. He watched me stumble to bed like clockwork, and he slept soundly beside me, satisfied that his plan was working exactly the way he wanted it to. What he never knew was that the cup in my hand was not the cup he had poured. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because before I tell you how I found out, before I tell you what he put in that tea, and before I tell you what I did about it, I need you to understand who Daniel was to me and who I thought I was to him. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Claire Bennett, and 3 months before I started swapping our cups, I would have told you my marriage was ordinary in the best possible way. Not the kind of ordinary that bores you, but the kind that feels safe. Daniel and I have been married for 6 years. We met in our late 20s, both of us tired of the dating scene, both of us ready for something steady. He worked in commercial insurance, the kind of job that came with long hours but a comfortable, predictable paycheck. I taught second grade at an elementary school 20 minutes from our house. We had a routine. He made coffee in the mornings. I packed his lunch on Sundays for the whole week because he always forgot and bought something expensive and unhealthy if I didn't. We had a dog named Biscuit, an old golden retriever who slept at the foot of our bed every night without fail. From the outside, and even from the inside, most days we looked like a couple who had figured it out. The tea started as my idea, which is part of what makes everything that followed so difficult to sit with. About 8 months before any of this began, my doctor mentioned that my sleep patterns were a mess. I was waking up at 3 in the morning almost every night, lying there staring at the ceiling until my alarm went off. She suggested a wind-down routine, and I landed on a cup of chamomile tea every night around 9. Daniel thought it was sweet. He started making it for me without me asking, warming the water, choosing the mug, bringing it to me on the couch while I graded papers or watched something mindless on television. I remember telling my sister Megan on the phone that I'd married a man who made me tea every night without being asked, and she told me I was lucky, and I believed her completely. For the first few weeks, nothing about the tea felt strange at all. I drank it. I felt sleepy within the hour, and I went to bed. It worked. My sleep improved. I told my doctor in my next appointment that the routine had helped, and she seemed pleased, and I moved on with my life without giving it another thought. Daniel kept making the tea every night, and I kept drinking it every night, and that small ritual became one of those quiet markers of our marriage, the kind of thing you don't think about until you have a reason to. The reason came on a Tuesday in late February. I had stayed late at school for a parent-teacher conference that ran longer than expected, and by the time I got home, Daniel had already started the tea without me. I walked into the kitchen just as he was pouring water into my mug, and I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. He had 2 small bottles lined up on the counter next to the kettle. One was honey, which I always added myself. The other was something I didn't recognize. A brown glass bottle with a dropper top, the kind you'd see in a health food store for vitamins or tinctures. When he saw me standing there, he moved quickly, almost too quickly, sliding the brown bottle into the drawer beside the stove before I could get a clear look at it. I asked him what it was. He said it was a new magnesium supplement he'd read about online, something to help with sleep, and he'd been adding a few drops to my tea to help me sleep better without telling me because he didn't want me to make a big deal out of it. He smiled when he said it, the same easy smile he always gave me, and at the time I let it go. I told him I appreciated him looking out for me, and I drank the tea he handed me that night, and I felt the same heaviness settle into my limbs that I always felt, and I went to bed. But something about that moment stayed, lodged in my mind in a way I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't suspicion yet. It was something smaller and harder to name, a tiny splinter of unease that I kept picking at without meaning to. Over the next week, I started watching him more closely when he made the tea, not because I thought he was doing anything wrong, but because the image of that bottle disappearing into the drawer kept replaying in my head. I noticed that he always made the tea himself now, every single night, when before it had been more occasional, something he did when he felt like it. I noticed that he started timing it more deliberately, always around 9, always right before we sat down together for the last hour before bed. I noticed that he watched me drink it in a way that felt different from before, not affectionate exactly, but attentive, like he was checking something off a list. I told myself I was overthinking things. 6 years of marriage teaches you that your spouse has habits and quirks that don't always make sense, and most of the time there's nothing underneath them except the ordinary mess of being human. Daniel had never given me a reason to distrust him. He didn't have a history of lying to me about anything significant. We argued sometimes, like every couple does, mostly about money or whose turn it was to deal with his mother's phone calls, but nothing that suggested the kind of person who would hide something from me on purpose. And yet the splinter stayed there, small and persistent, and I found myself thinking about that brown bottle at odd moments during the day, while I was teaching a lesson on fractions, while I was driving home from the grocery store, while I was lying awake at 3 a.m. during the nights when the tea hadn't quite done its job. The thing that finally pushed me from unease into something closer to suspicion happened almost 3 weeks after I first saw the bottle. I had a stomach bug that kept me home from school on a Thursday, and I spent most of the day in bed, dozing on and off, feeling miserable in the particular way that low-grade illness makes you feel. Around 4 in the afternoon, I heard Daniel come home early, which was unusual for him. He worked until at least 6 most days. I called out to him from the bedroom, and he came in to check on me, brought me water, asked if I needed anything, the kind of attentive husband behavior that should have felt comforting. He told me he had a headache and was going to lie down in the guest room, so he wouldn't catch whatever I had, and I thought nothing of it. But later that evening, when I got up to use the bathroom, I passed by the guest room, and the door was open just enough for me to see him sitting at the small desk in there, on his laptop, with that same brown bottle sitting next to the computer. He wasn't making tea. He was just looking at the bottle, turning it over in his hands, reading something on his screen with an expression I had never seen on his face before, a kind of careful, calculating focus that didn't match the easygoing man I had married. I stood in the hallway for maybe 10 seconds, frozen, watching him through the gap in the door, and then I quietly went back to bed before he noticed me there. I didn't sleep that night, stomach bug or not. I lay next to him in the dark, listening to his breathing slow into sleep, and I thought about the way he'd looked at that bottle, the careful way he'd hidden it weeks earlier, the new ritual of the tea that had shifted from something casual into something precise. I thought about how, when I was sick that day and couldn't drink my evening tea, he hadn't seemed disappointed exactly, but he had checked on me about it twice, asking if I was sure I didn't want just a small cup, that it might help settle my stomach. I had said no both times, and he had let it go, but the asking itself felt different now, viewed through the lens of what I'd just seen. The next morning, while Daniel was in the shower, I did something I had never done in 6 years of marriage. I went into the guest room and opened the drawer of that desk, looking for the brown bottle. It wasn't there. I checked the kitchen drawer where I'd first seen him put it, and it wasn't there either. I searched for almost 15 minutes before I found it tucked inside a winter glove in the front hall closet, shoved into the toe in a way that felt deliberate, like he'd specifically chosen a place I would never have a reason to look. My hands were shaking by the time I held it. There was no label on it beyond a small printed sticker that just said Sleep Aid in plain black text. No brand name, no ingredient list, nothing that would tell me what was actually inside. I put it back exactly where I found it, shoved into the toe of that glove, and I closed the closet door, and I went about my morning as if nothing had happened because some instinct in me, something I couldn't fully explain even to myself, told me that the moment Daniel realized I knew about that bottle, everything would change and not necessarily for the better. I made breakfast. I kissed him goodbye when he left for work. I went to school and taught my second graders about plant life cycles, and the entire time, underneath the surface of my normal day, a single question repeated itself over and over in my mind. What exactly was my husband putting in my tea, and why was he hiding it so carefully from the one person who was supposed to be able to trust him completely? That night, when Daniel made the tea, as usual, I watched him add the honey, watched him turn his back to me for just a few seconds longer than necessary while reaching into the cabinet, and I felt something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I drank the tea that night because I didn't yet know what else to do, because I didn't have proof of anything, because accusing my husband of drugging me based on a hidden bottle and a strange look on his face felt like the kind of thing that could blow up a marriage if I was wrong, and I desperately wanted to be wrong. But as I felt the familiar heaviness pull at my eyelids that night, I made a decision that would change everything that followed. I decided I needed to know the truth, no matter what it cost me to find it. The decision to find the truth is easy to make in the dark, lying awake at midnight with your heart pounding. It is much harder to act on in the daylight, when you still have to get up, make coffee, and look your husband in the eye across the breakfast table. For the first few days after I found that bottle, I did nothing except watch. I watched Daniel more closely than I had ever watched another human being in my life. I watched how he held his face when he talked about his day at work, searching for some sign that he was hiding more than just a bottle in a glove. I watched how he touched me, whether his hands lingered the way they used to, whether his kindness still felt like kindness or had started to feel like something else, something performed. The hardest part was that nothing about him seemed to change. He was still Daniel. He still laughed at the same shows, still complained about his coworker Greg who left dishes in the office sink, still rubbed Biscuit's ears every night before bed. If he was hiding something, he was hiding it inside a man I recognized completely, and that frightened me more than if he had suddenly become a stranger. I confided in my sister Megan about a week after I found the bottle, because I needed to say the words out loud to someone who wasn't going to immediately assume I'd lost my mind. Megan and I had always been close, the kind of sisters who told each other everything, even the things that made us look bad. I called her on a Saturday morning while Daniel was out playing golf with his brother, and I told her everything: the bottle, the hiding spot, the look on his face in the guest room, the way the tea ritual had shifted from casual to precise. I expected her to tell me I was reading too much into things, that 6 years of marriage didn't disappear over a strange supplement bottle. Instead, she went quiet for a long moment, and then she asked me a question that changed the direction of everything that followed. She asked me what would happen if I simply stopped drinking the tea for a few nights and watch how he reacted. It was such a simple idea, and yet it had not occurred to me, because some part of me had already decided that confronting the situation directly, even in this small experimental way, was too dangerous. But Megan's question sat with me for the rest of that day, and by the time Daniel came home from golf, sunburned and cheerful, smelling like beer and grass, I had decided to try it. That night, when he handed me my cup of tea, I took it from him, thanked him the way I always did, and set it on the side table next to the couch instead of drinking it right away. I told him I wanted to finish a chapter of the book I was reading first, which was true, and which gave me a reason to let the cup sit untouched for a while. I watched him out of the corner of my eye while I pretended to read. He didn't say anything at first, just settled into his side of the couch with his phone, scrolling through something, looking perfectly relaxed. But after about 10 minutes, he glanced over my cup, still full, still untouched, and I saw something flicker across his face that I can only describe as discomfort. He asked if my tea had gotten cold, offered to make me a fresh cup. I told him it was fine, that I just wasn't thirsty yet, and I picked it up and took a small sip, just enough to wet my lips, and set it back down. He watched me do this with an intensity that confirmed something I had been trying not to believe. He needed me to drink that tea. Not wanted, needed. Over the following week, I ran a version of the same experiment several more times, always with small variations so it wouldn't seem deliberate. Some nights I drank the tea quickly, the way I always had. Other nights, I let it sit, or I poured half of it down the bathroom sink when I excused myself, or I simply held the cup without drinking much at all. The pattern that emerged was impossible to ignore. On the nights I drank the tea fully, I felt the same heavy, drugged exhaustion I'd grown used to over the past several months, the kind of tiredness that pulled me under almost against my will. On the nights I drank very little of it, I stayed alert, my mind clear, and more than once I noticed myself waking up at 2 or 3 in the morning feeling strangely sharp, almost unnervingly awake compared to how foggy my nights usually felt. I started keeping a small notebook hidden in my classroom desk at school, far from our house, where I tracked these experiments along with dates and small details about Daniel's behavior. I wrote down the nights he seemed anxious when I didn't finish my tea. I wrote down a night he suggested, almost too casually, that we should make it a system where he always poured the tea exactly the same way, so I would get used to the routine, which struck me as a strange thing to care about unless the exact dosage mattered to him for some reason. I wrote down the way he started asking me, more than once, how I'd been sleeping, with a specificity that felt less like concern and more like data collection. By the end of that second week, my notebook held enough small, strange details that even I, desperate as I was to find an innocent explanation, could no longer convince myself this was nothing. The turning point came on a rainy Wednesday night in early March, almost a month after I'd first seen that brown bottle on the counter. Daniel had gone to bed early, complaining of a headache, and I told him I would join him soon, that I wanted to finish cleaning up the kitchen first. Once I heard the bedroom door close, I went straight to the front hall closet and found the glove where I'd seen the bottle weeks before. It was still there. I took it into the bathroom, locked the door, and examined it as closely as I could without any way of testing what was inside. There was nothing more to learn from looking at it again, but I did something I hadn't done the first time. I took a small sample, just a few drops, and sealed it inside a tiny travel-sized container I emptied out from an old contact lens case, and I hid that container inside a tampon box under the bathroom sink, certain it was the one place in our house Daniel would never think to search. The following Monday, during my lunch break at school, I drove to a small private lab I had found through an internet search the week before, the kind of independent testing facility that handles things like paternity tests and substance screenings for people who don't want to go through more official channels. I paid in cash. I gave a fake name, Sarah Coleman, because some instinct told me I needed to keep my real identity separate from whatever this sample turned out to reveal. I dropped off the small vial, paid the rush fee to get results within 5 business days, and drove back to school in time for recess duty, feeling like I had stepped outside of my own life and into someone else's story. The 5 days I waited for those results were some of the longest of my life. I went through the motions of my normal routine, teaching my students, making dinner, sitting across from Daniel every night, drinking small, careful sips of tea so as not to alarm him, while privately counting down the hours until I would know what I was truly dealing with. On the 3rd day of waiting, something happened that pushed my fear into a different register entirely. I came home from school to find Daniel on the phone in the garage, a place he almost never went to make calls, with the door pulled nearly shut. I caught only a fragment of what he said before he noticed me through the small garage window and ended the call abruptly. The fragment was this. He said the words, "Once it's done, the policy pays out within 30 days, so timing matters." I want to be honest with you about what that sentence did to me, hearing it through a half-closed door in my own garage from the mouth of the man I had built a life with. It did not feel like fear in the way I expected fear to feel, sharp and immediate. It felt like the floor of my entire life quietly giving way beneath me, slow and total, the kind of falling where you don't even have time to scream before you're already at the bottom. I didn't ask him about the call. I smiled when he came inside, told him I'd had a long day, and went upstairs to grade papers I never actually graded because my hands were trembling too badly to hold a pen steady. The lab results came back on a Friday afternoon, delivered by email under the fake name I'd given. I read them sitting in my car in the school parking lot after the last bell, alone with the windows up. The sample contained a combination of 2 substances. The first was called Centrazole, a sedative commonly prescribed for anxiety and sleep disorders, available only with a prescription, the kind of medication that in small doses might genuinely help someone sleep, but in repeated, nightly doses over months could cause exactly the kind of grogginess, memory fog, and physical exhaustion I had been experiencing for the better part of a year. The second substance listed was called Vextramine, something I had to search for separately once I got home because I didn't recognize the name. When I found information about it, my hands went cold. It was a substance that, in the kind of cumulative low doses someone might administer over an extended period, has been associated with cardiac strain and, in rare cases, has been linked to heart failure in people with no prior history of heart problems. I sat in my car for almost 40 minutes after reading that, staring at the steering wheel, putting together pieces I had been too afraid to fully assemble before that moment. The supplement bottle that wasn't really a supplement. The careful, deliberate ritual of the tea every single night without exception. The phone call about a policy that pays out within 30 days. My grandmother had died of a sudden, unexplained heart event 2 years earlier, and I remembered, with a sickening clarity, a conversation Daniel and I had about it at the time, where he had asked, almost idly, whether such things ran in families. I had told him no, that my grandmother's death had been a freak occurrence, nothing genetic, nothing anyone saw coming. I understood now, sitting in that parking lot, why that question might have mattered to him so much. That night, for the first time, I did not drink any of the tea Daniel made me. I told him I had a stomachache from something I ate at school, which was a small enough lie that it wouldn't raise suspicion, and I asked him to set the cup down so I could drink it once my stomach settled. He left the cup on the side table, and once he went to take a shower, I carried it into the kitchen and poured it down the drain, rinsing the cup thoroughly before setting it back exactly where it belonged. I knew, watching the pale liquid disappear down the drain, that I had crossed some invisible threshold. I was no longer a wife wondering if something was wrong. I was a woman who knew, with as much certainty as a private lab report could provide, that her husband was slowly poisoning her, and who now had to decide what to do with that knowledge before he succeeded. The plan to swap our cups came to me 3 days later, not as a single brilliant idea, but as the only logical solution to a problem that had no good options. I could not simply confront Daniel, because I had no idea what he might do if he realized I knew, and the phone call about the insurance policy told me this was not a man having a moment of weakness, but someone executing a plan with a timeline. I could not go to the police yet, because a private lab report under a fake name and a fragment of an overheard phone call, while damning to me, would not be enough on its own to build a case against him, especially not one that would protect me in the meantime. What I needed was time and proof and a way to stop the poison from continuing to enter my body while I gathered both of those things. The solution, when it finally became clear to me, was almost embarrassingly simple. Daniel always used the same 2 mugs for our nightly tea, a pale blue one for himself and a cream-colored one with a small chip on the handle for me, a pattern so consistent that he never even had to think about which cup was which anymore. If I switched which cup he handed to me, switched it so subtly that the difference would be almost impossible to notice in the low light of our living room in the evening, he would keep pouring the same medicated tea into the cup he believed was mine, and I would simply make sure that cup ended up in his hands instead of mine. The first time I actually swapped the cups, my hands were shaking so badly I was certain Daniel would notice, even though his back was turned to me at the counter while he stirred in the contents of that brown bottle. It was a Tuesday night, about 4 months into our marriage's slow unraveling, though I was the only one who knew it was unraveling at all. I had spent the previous 2 days rehearsing this moment in my mind, practicing the small, casual movement it would take to switch which cup ended up where. The trick, I realized, was timing. Daniel always carried both cups to the living room at once, one in each hand, setting mine down on the side table to my right and his own on the table to his left, a habit so ingrained that he never paused to think about it. All I needed to do was create a reason to be standing near those side tables in the brief window between him setting the cups down and either of us picking them up. That first night, I used biscuit as my excuse. Just as Daniel set the cups down, I called the dog over, kneeling down near the side tables to scratch behind his ears, my body positioned perfectly between both mugs. In the 2 or 3 seconds it took Daniel to settle into his side of the couch and reach for his phone, I switched the cups, sliding the pale blue one to my side and the cream-colored chipped one to his. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he might actually hear it. But he didn't look up from his phone until both of us had cups in front of us, and by then, the swap was complete. I watched him pick up what he believed was his own normal, unmedicated tea, the cream-colored cup with the chip, and take a long, easy sip without a second thought. I picked up the pale blue cup, the one that should have contained the cintrazole and the vextramine I now knew could damage a heart over time, and I held it to my lips, but I did not drink it. I simply let the warmth of the ceramic touch my mouth, the way you might do absent-mindedly while watching television, and I set it back down within a few seconds, untouched beneath the surface of things. For the rest of that evening, I watched Daniel with an attention that felt almost unbearable, terrified that he would notice some shift in his own body that didn't match what he expected. But nothing in his behavior changed. He finished his tea, set the empty cream-colored cup on the counter, and went about the rest of his evening exactly as he always did, scrolling on his phone, half watching a show with me, eventually yawning and announcing he was tired. I realized, watching him stand up and stretch, completely unaffected, that the sedative dose Daniel had been giving me was apparently calibrated for my body weight and tolerance, not his, because he showed no signs of the heaviness I usually felt by that point in the evening. This detail mattered more than I initially understood, because it told me something important. Whatever he was doing it with precision. This was not a man impulsively dumping a few drops in a tea on a whim. This was someone who had thought carefully about dosage, about consistency, about making sure the effect matched exactly what he wanted it to be. That night, lying in bed next to him, fully alert for the first time in what felt like forever, I experienced something close to vertigo. My body had grown so used to the nightly fog of sedation that being completely clear-headed at 10 at night felt almost disorienting, like stepping off a moving walkway after standing still on it for too long. I lay there listening to Daniel's breathing beside me, waiting to see if he would notice anything different about me, but he fell asleep within 20 minutes, just as he always did, completely unaware that the dynamic between us had just shifted in a way he could not see or feel. I stared at the ceiling for hours that night, my mind racing through everything I now needed to do. And for the first time since I'd found that bottle, I felt something other than fear. I felt a strange, quiet sense of control returning to me, piece by piece. Over the following weeks, the cup swap became a ritual of its own, layered invisibly beneath the ritual Daniel believed he controlled. I got better at it, finding small reasons every night to be near the side tables in that brief window of opportunity. Some nights, I asked him a question that made him turn slightly to answer, buying myself the half-second I needed. Other nights I used biscuit again, or pretended to adjust a throw pillow, or simply time my movements to the rhythm of whatever show was playing on the television, since Daniel tended to glance toward the screen during certain moments. I never repeated the same method too many nights in a row, partly out of genuine caution, and partly because the small act of outsmarting him, again and again, had become the only thing keeping me steady through what was otherwise one of the most frightening periods of my life. What surprised me most during this time was how easy it became to perform the role Daniel expected me to play. I started acting sleepy in the evenings, even though I felt completely clear, letting my eyelids droop a little, slowing my speech, allowing myself to seem distracted in the particular way sedation had once made me distracted. I did this because I understood, instinctively, that if Daniel noticed I had suddenly become alert and sharp every evening after months of grogginess, he would immediately suspect something had changed, and I could not risk him discovering the swap before I was ready. So I became an actress in my own home, performing the symptoms of a poisoning that was no longer happening to me, while the actual effects of that poisoning were now landing slowly and invisibly on the man responsible for creating them in the first place. I want to pause here and be honest about something, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. There were nights during this period when I felt the full weight of what I was doing settle on me in a way that made it hard to breathe. I was, after all, allowing my husband to ingest the same substances he had been giving me for months, substances I now knew carried real risk to his heart over time. Some part of me wrestled with whether this made me no better than him, whether two wrongs could somehow cancel each other out, or whether I was simply protecting myself using the only tool he had given me. I did not have a clean answer to that question then, and I'm not sure I have a perfectly clean answer to it now. What I can tell you is that every time I considered stopping, every time I thought about simply pouring both cups down the drain and finding some other way to handle the situation, I would remember the fragment of that phone call in the garage, the words about a policy paying out within 30 days. And I would think about what might have happened to me if Megan had never asked that simple question about whether I could stop drinking the tea and watch how he reacted. I told myself I was buying time, not seeking revenge, though I understand that line can look thin from the outside. The proof I needed continued to build during this stretch of weeks, almost by accident at first. Daniel, now unknowingly experiencing the same grogginess I'd been performing for him, started making small mistakes he never would have made before. He left his laptop open one evening after falling asleep on the couch earlier than usual, something that had never happened in 6 years of marriage. And I found myself standing over it, my heart hammering, scrolling through his browser history while he slept upstairs. Most of it was unremarkable, sports scores, work emails, but tucked among the ordinary searches was a string of queries about life insurance payout timelines, about whether centrazole could be detected in a standard autopsy, and about cardiac conditions that could be mistaken for natural causes in a woman in her 30s with no prior health issues. I took photographs of every relevant page with my phone, my hand steady in a way that surprised me, given how violently my heart was beating in my chest. A week after that discovery, another piece fell into place when I finally identified the woman Daniel had been calling from the garage on multiple occasions, a co-worker from his office named Vanessa Whitfield, someone he had mentioned only in passing once or twice over the past year, as simply being part of his team. I found her name attached to a contact saved in his phone under a different label entirely, listed not as Vanessa from work, but under a nickname that made the nature of their relationship unmistakable. I did not yet understand the full scope of what existed between them, whether this was a simple affair or something deeper tangled up with the plan I now believe Daniel was executing against me, but I understood enough to know that the motive behind the bottle and the glove and the phone call about timing was not abstract or financial alone. There was another person involved in whatever future Daniel believed was coming for him, a future that apparently did not include me in it all. Once I knew Vanessa Whitfield's name, I could not stop myself from learning everything I could about her, even though I understood, somewhere in the rational part of my mind, that this knowledge alone would not change my immediate situation. I found her on social media within minutes, a woman a few years younger than me, blonde, polished, the kind of profile filled with vacation photos and gym selfies and captions that radiated a confidence I had not felt in months. I scrolled through years of her posts looking for any mention of Daniel, any photograph that might place them together outside the context of an office, and I found nothing obvious at first, which told me they had been careful, deliberate, the same way Daniel had been careful and deliberate about the bottle and the glove. It was only when I cross-referenced the dates of a work conference Daniel had attended 4 months earlier with a single, vague photo Vanessa had posted from what she described only as a great weekend away, the background unmistakably the same hotel lobby Daniel had shown me in pictures from that same trip, that I understood how long this had likely been going on. I did not confront Daniel with any of this. Every instinct in me said that the moment he understood I knew about Vanessa, about the searches on his laptop, about the substances in the tea, he would either find a way to accelerate whatever plan he had, or he would simply disappear with whatever resources he could gather, leaving me with suspicion but no real recourse. So I continued the quiet, exhausting work of living 2 lives inside the same house. By day, I was Claire Bennett, second-grade teacher, dutiful wife, a woman slowly succumbing to whatever was wrong with her health. By night, after the cups were swapped and the performance of grogginess was complete, I became someone else entirely, someone documenting, researching, and preparing, often until 1 or 2 in the morning while Daniel slept soundly beside me. More deeply and more often than he used to, a change I now understood was the direct result of the dose he had been unknowingly drinking for weeks. It was during this period that I started noticing changes in Daniel himself, changes that frightened me in an entirely different way than anything before. He began complaining of fatigue that didn't match his usual energy, telling me he felt unusually tired even after a full night's sleep, the exact complaint I had been making to him for months before I started the swap. He mentioned, almost in passing one evening, that his heart had felt strange a few times, a kind of fluttering sensation he assumed was stress from work. I remember sitting across from him at dinner that night, watching him rub his chest absent-mindedly, and feeling a wave of something complicated wash over me, guilt tangled together with a grim, unwanted vindication. Here was proof, walking and talking and sitting across from me at our own kitchen table, that the substance in that brown bottle was exactly as dangerous as the lab report had suggested. I told him he should see a doctor if the fluttering continued, and he waved me off the way he always waved off concerns about himself, certain, as he had always been certain about everything in his life, that nothing serious could actually happen to him. I want to tell you about the night everything almost fell apart, because it is the night that taught me how close I had come to losing control of a situation I believed I had carefully managed. It happened on a Friday in early April, almost 6 weeks into the cup swapping, when Daniel came home from work earlier than expected and walked into the kitchen just as I was finishing preparing the tea myself, something I had started doing occasionally to maintain the appearance of normalcy and to control, in small ways, how the ritual unfolded. He asked, casually at first, why I was making the tea that night instead of him, and I told him I'd gotten home early and wanted to surprise him with it ready by the time he settled in. He smiled, seemed to accept this, and went to change out of his work clothes. But when he came back downstairs, he picked up the cream-colored cup, the one with the chip, the one that had become his cup over the past 6 weeks without him fully realizing it, and held it for a long moment before drinking, studying it almost the way you might study something unfamiliar. He asked me, in a tone that tried to sound light but didn't quite manage it, whether I had switched up the recipe, because the tea tasted slightly different to him that night. My heart stopped for what felt like a full minute. I told him I might have used a slightly different brand of chamomile, since I'd run out of the usual box and grabbed whatever was available at the store, and I watched his face carefully while I said it, searching for any sign that he didn't believe me. After a pause that lasted only a few seconds but felt endless, he shrugged, said it probably wasn't a big deal, and finished the cup anyway. I excused myself to the bathroom shortly after, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the tub shaking for several minutes, understanding with absolute clarity that I had come within a single suspicious comment of having the entire plan unravel before I had gathered enough to protect myself. That close call forced me to make a decision I had been avoiding for weeks. I needed an ally outside of Megan, someone with actual expertise who could tell me what to do with the evidence I had collected and how to do it safely. Through a friend of friend, I found a private investigator named Marcus Hale, a former police detective who now worked independently, specializing in cases involving domestic situations that hadn't yet escalated into something law enforcement would formally pursue. I met with him on a Saturday afternoon while Daniel was at a work event, sitting in Marcus's small office above a dry cleaner, laying out everything I had. The lab report under the fake name, the photographs from Daniel's laptop, the screenshots of Vanessa's social media, and the matching hotel lobby. My notebook full of dated observations stretching back over 2 months. Marcus listened to all of it without interrupting, occasionally jotting something down, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment before telling me something that both reassured me and terrified me in equal measure. He said that what I had assembled was a serious foundation, more thorough than most people manage in situations like this, but that a few key pieces were still missing if I wanted this to result in real legal consequences for Daniel, rather than simply confirming what I already suspected. He said I needed something connecting the insurance policy directly to a recent date, ideally a copy of the policy itself or correspondence about it, and I needed something that established intent more directly than an overheard phone fragment, something like a recording or a written communication between Daniel and Vanessa that revealed the plan explicitly rather than implying it. He told me he could help me find these things, carefully and legally, in ways that wouldn't put me at greater risk, but that it would take patience, and that patience, given what Daniel was apparently capable of, came with its own danger attached. I left that meeting with a strange mixture of relief and dread sitting heavy in my stomach. Relief because for the first time since this began, I was not facing this alone, working entirely from instinct and fear in the dark of our living room every night. Dread because Marcus's words made clear that I was not yet at the end of this, that there was still real work ahead, still real risk to manage, and that every additional week I spent gathering proof was another week Daniel's body continued absorbing whatever he had once intended only for mine. I drove home that afternoon, turning over a question that would follow me for the rest of this story, a question I am not sure I have ever fully resolved even now. How long could I continue protecting myself by letting harm fall on someone else, Even someone who had tried to do far worse to me first, before that choice became something I would have to answer for in ways beyond just my own conscience. Marcus Hale worked quickly once he understood the shape of what we were dealing with. And over the following 2 weeks, he uncovered pieces of this story that I could never have found on my own. Using public records, he confirmed that Daniel had taken out a life insurance policy on me 8 months earlier, a policy with a payout significantly larger than anything reasonable for a household at our income level, listing himself as the sole beneficiary. The timing of that policy lined up almost exactly with the period when the tea ritual had shifted from occasional to nightly, a detail that turned what had felt like a frightening theory into something closer to an undeniable timeline. Marcus also managed to obtain, through what he described only as legitimate channels he was authorized to use as a licensed investigator, copies of text messages between Daniel and Vanessa stretching back nearly a year, far more explicit in their content than anything I had imagined while scrolling through her curated social media photos. I read those messages in Marcus's office on a Thursday evening, and I want to be honest that nothing could have fully prepared me for seeing, in Daniel's own words, in his own phone, plans being made for a future that depended entirely on my absence from it. There were messages about waiting for the right timing. There were messages about the insurance payout being enough to cover a down payment on a house Vanessa had apparently already started looking at online, a house she had sent him listings for, including one message where Daniel had replied that they should wait until after to start seriously looking, so nothing looked planned in advance if anyone ever asked questions. There was a message dated only 6 weeks before I'd first noticed that brown bottle on the counter, where Daniel told Vanessa that he'd found something online that would be undetectable in normal circumstances, slow enough that no one would suspect anything sudden, and that he just needed to be patient and consistent with the dosage. Reading the words slow enough that no one would suspect anything sudden, written by the man who slept beside me every night, who still occasionally reached for my hand to sleep out of some unconscious habit built over 6 years together, did something to me that I'm still working to fully understand even now. It was not simply fear, though fear was certainly present. It was a kind of grief that arrived without warning, grief for the marriage I had believed I was living inside of, grief for the version of Daniel I had loved, who I now understood may never have fully existed in the way I thought he did, or who had existed once and had been slowly replaced by someone capable of writing those words to another woman about me. Marcus told me, once I had composed myself enough to keep talking, that what we now had was more than enough to involve the police, but he also told me something that complicated the simple relief I expected to feel at that statement. He explained that cases like this, built on private investigation and a complicated personal history, often move slower through the legal system than people expect, and that in the meantime, Daniel would almost certainly continue living in our house with me, would almost certainly continue believing his plan was on track, unless I made a decision about how and when to reveal what I knew. Marcus laid out 2 paths in front of me that evening. I could go to the police immediately with everything we had, which would likely result in an investigation, possibly an arrest, but would also mean leaving the home I lived in, staying somewhere safer while the legal process unfolded, with no guarantee of how quickly any of it would actually resolve. Or I could continue what I had already been doing for the past several weeks, the quiet performance of victimhood, while collecting just enough additional proof to remove any possible doubt, and choose the moment of confrontation myself, on my own terms, with the police already prepared to act the instant I gave the signal. I chose the second path, though I want to be honest that this was not purely a strategic decision. Some part of me, the part that had spent months performing exhaustion and confusion while secretly outmaneuvering a man trying to kill me, wanted to be the one who ended this on my own terms, rather than simply handing the entire story over to people who had not lived inside it the way I had. Marcus did not love this decision, and he told me so directly, warning me that every additional day carried risk, that Daniel's patience could run out, that Vanessa's involvement introduced unpredictability he could not fully account for. But he also respected that this was ultimately my choice to make, and he agreed to help me set up the final pieces needed to make a confrontation, when it came, both safe and irreversible. Over the following 10 days, working with Marcus, We built what amounted to a careful trap disguised as an ordinary continuation of my life. I wore a small recording device, provided and legally cleared by Marcus for use in our state, hidden in a pendant necklace I started wearing every day, the kind of accessory ordinary enough that Daniel never gave it a second glance. I continued the cup swap every single night. Now, documenting on video, captured discreetly through a small camera. Marcus helped me position inside a decorative plant on the kitchen counter, the moment of the swap itself, evidence that would make undeniable both what Daniel had been putting into that tea and the fact that I had redirected it toward him for weeks without his knowledge. I continued performing grogginess in the evenings while Daniel, increasingly, did not have to perform anything at all, his genuine fatigue and the occasional fluttering in his chest becoming simply part of how he moved through our nights together. The final piece came together almost by chance, in a way that still strikes me as either luck or some kind of inevitable unraveling that happens when people build their lives on lies for long enough. Daniel had a work trip planned for a Thursday and Friday in the middle of April, a trip I knew, thanks to Marcus's research, that Vanessa was also attending. The night before he left, sitting on our couch with Biscuit's head resting on my lap, Daniel mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he might extend the trip through the weekend if work allowed, and something in the way he said it, a kind of barely contained anticipation he probably didn't even realize was visible on his face, told me this would not simply be a work trip. I called Marcus that same night after Daniel had gone to bed, and we agreed that this trip represented the moment to act, that whatever happened between Daniel and Vanessa over those days away would likely produce exactly the kind of unguarded conversation, recorded or otherwise documented, that could remove any final doubt about what I was dealing with. I drove Daniel to the airport myself on that Thursday morning, kissed him goodbye at the curb the way I always did, told him to text me when he landed, and watched him walk through the doors of the terminal believing, as he had believed for months, that he was leaving behind a wife who was growing weaker and more confused by the week, a wife whose future, in his mind, was already beginning to close. I drove home from that airport feeling something I had not felt in a very long time, a strange, quiet calm settling over me, because I understood with complete certainty that whatever happened next, I was no longer the person standing helplessly inside someone else's plan. I had become the author of what would happen next. And Daniel, boarding that plane beside a woman who believed she was about to start a new life with him, had absolutely no idea that the story he thought he was living inside of had already changed entirely 3 months earlier, the very first night I swapped our cups. Daniel texted me when he landed, just as he always did, a short message telling me the flight had been smooth and that he loved me, words that landed strangely in my chest, given everything Marcus and I now knew about what this trip actually represented. I responded the way I always responded, with warmth that cost me nothing to fake anymore, because faking warmth toward Daniel had become, over the past several months, something closer to a professional skill than an emotional struggle. Marcus had arranged, through methods he again described only vaguely as legitimate investigative tools available to licensed professionals, a way to monitor activity on the recording pendant remotely, since Daniel would be wearing his own phone and presumably spending considerable time with Vanessa over the following 2 days, time during which the pendant, left in our bedroom rather than traveling with me, would capture nothing. Instead, what we were truly waiting on was simpler and, in some ways, more reliable than any hidden device. We were waiting on Vanessa herself. Marcus had identified, through her social media activity and a few public posts she had not bothered to make private, that Vanessa had a habit of documenting significant life moments in long, emotional captions, the kind of digital diary entries some people can't resist sharing even when discretion would clearly serve them better. He suspected that if this weekend represented some kind of turning point in her relationship with Daniel, a deepening of whatever future they believed they were building together, she might post something revealing, especially once enough wine and distance from home loosened the careful privacy she had otherwise maintained. He was right. On Friday evening, the second night of the trip, Vanessa posted a photo to an account she had not realized Marcus was monitoring through a secondary profile he had built specifically to follow her without detection, a photo of a hotel balcony overlooking a city skyline, captioned with words that made my stomach turn even though I had spent weeks preparing myself for exactly this kind of confirmation. She wrote about finally being able to see a future without waiting any longer, about being so close to something neither of them had been brave enough to say out loud until this trip, and she tagged the location, a luxury hotel 2 hours from where Daniel's actual work conference was being held, nowhere near the venue he had told me he would be staying. Marcus called me himself that night, something he had not done before throughout our entire arrangement, and I understood from the seriousness in his voice that this was the moment everything had been building toward. He told me he believed we now had sufficient grounds to bring in the police directly, that the combination of the lab report, the laptop searches, the insurance policy, the text messages, the recorded weeks of cups swapping on camera, and now this public post timestamped at a hotel 2 hours from where Daniel claimed to be, created a picture clear enough that law enforcement would take it seriously rather than dismissing it as a wife suspicion during a difficult marriage. He asked me how I wanted to proceed, whether I wanted him to make the call to the detective he already had a working relationship with, or whether I wanted to wait until Daniel returned home to confront him directly first. I told him I needed one night to think, and he respected that, though I could hear in his voice that he hoped I wouldn't take long. That night, alone in our house, except for Biscuit curled up beside me on the couch, I allowed myself, for the first time in months, to fully feel the weight of everything that had happened. I cried in a way I had not let myself cry since this began, not from fear this time, but from something closer to mourning the 6 years I had spent believing I understood the shape of my own life, mourning the version of myself who had trusted so completely that she never once considered the man bringing her tea every night might be counting down toward her absence rather than caring for her presence. I thought about my grandmother, about the conversation Daniel and I had about her death 2 years earlier, and I wondered, with a kind of nausea I couldn't shake, whether that conversation had been the actual moment this entire plan had been born, whether watching how easily a family accepted a sudden, unexplained cardiac event had given him the idea in the first place. By morning, I had made my decision. I called Marcus and told him I wanted to involve the police now, before Daniel returned home, so that everything would already be in motion by the time he walked back through our front door, believing his weekend away had gone exactly as planned. Marcus connected me that same day with Detective Patricia Alvarez, a woman in her late 40s with the kind of calm, unhurried manner that made me feel, for the first time in this entire ordeal, that I was finally speaking to someone whose job it was to actually protect me rather than someone I had to convince. I spent nearly 3 hours with Detective Alvarez that Saturday afternoon, walking her through every piece of evidence Marcus and I had gathered, answering questions I had not previously considered, including questions about my own legal exposure, given that I had, after all, been administering a potentially harmful substance to Daniel for several weeks once I understood what it was. Detective Alvarez was direct with me about this concern, more direct than I expected, and I appreciated it even though it frightened me. She explained that my situation existed in a legally complicated space, that what I had done could theoretically expose me to scrutiny depending on how a prosecutor chose to view it, but that the clear evidence of Daniel's original intent, documented extensively before I ever began swapping the cups, along with the relatively low doses involved and the absence of any attempt on my part to actually cause him serious harm, made it very unlikely that I would face meaningful consequences, particularly once the full scope of his plan against me became clear. She told me, with a directness that felt almost maternal, that the most important thing now was building a case that would hold up cleanly, which meant I needed to stop swapping the cups immediately and let the investigation take its natural course from this point forward, rather than continuing to manage things myself. I agreed, though something in me resisted the idea of simply stepping back after months of being the one in control. Detective Alvarez explained the plan that would unfold once Daniel returned home that Sunday evening. Rather than confronting him myself, she wanted to coordinate a moment where she and her partner would arrive at our house shortly after Daniel and I had both returned to whatever passed for normal between us, using the pretext of a routine welfare check related to an anonymous tip, a pretext that would allow them to observe his behavior and begin building rapport before revealing the true scope of what they already knew. I would not need to say anything incriminating or confrontational myself. I would simply need to be present, to let the investigation unfold around me, after months of having to engineer every single moment myself. Daniel arrived home Sunday evening around 7, tan and relaxed in a way that, knowing what I now knew, struck me as almost grotesque. The relaxation of a man returning from what he believed was a successful step toward a future he had been carefully engineering for the better part of a year. He kissed me at the door, told me he'd missed me, asked how my weekend alone had been, and I told him it had been quiet, that I'd mostly rested, which was true in its own strange way. He went upstairs to unpack, and I stood in our kitchen, looking at the two mugs sitting in the drying rack, the pale blue one and the cream-colored one with the chip, understanding that within the hour, for the first time in 3 months, the small private war I had been fighting inside those two cups would finally become visible to the only other person who had ever held a stake in it. The doorbell rang at exactly 8:15 that evening, just as Detective Alvarez had told me it would, and I watched Daniel's face as he answered it, watched the easy, practiced confusion settle across his features when he saw 2 police officers standing on our porch, a confusion I now understood he was capable of performing just as convincingly as I had performed my own exhaustion for months. Detective Alvarez introduced herself and her partner, a younger officer named Detective Ruiz, explaining in a calm, procedural tone that they were following up on an anonymous tip regarding a welfare concern at this address, the kind of vague, bureaucratic language designed specifically to give nothing away while still gaining entry into the house. Daniel, ever the picture of cooperative concern, invited them inside immediately, asked what kind of welfare concern they were referring to, and offered them something to drink, an offer that, given everything sitting unspoken in that kitchen, struck me as almost unbearably ironic. I sat on the couch while Detective Alvarez asked Daniel a series of seemingly routine questions about how things were at home, about whether either of us had any health concerns, about whether we had experienced any recent stress or conflict in the marriage. Daniel answered everything smoothly, painting a picture of a happy, ordinary couple, occasionally reaching over to pat my knee in a gesture of practiced affection that I had to force myself not to flinch away from. I watched him lie with such fluency, such apparent ease, that for a brief, disorienting moment, I almost doubted everything I knew to be true. Almost wondered if I had somehow built an elaborate fiction out of misread signals and bad luck. That doubt lasted only a few seconds, dissolving the moment Detective Alvarez shifted the conversation, almost imperceptibly, toward more specific territory. She asked Daniel, in the same even tone she had used for every other question, whether he was familiar with a substance called Centrazol, the same substance the lab had identified in my teen months earlier. I watched something flicker across his face, fast but unmistakable, the first genuine crack I had seen in his composure in 3 months of careful observation. He said he wasn't familiar with it, his voice slightly higher than it had been a moment before, and Detective Alvarez nodded, made a note, and then asked whether he was aware that a life insurance policy had been taken out on his wife 8 months earlier with a payout structure significantly above standard recommendations for a household at our income level. This time, the crack widened into something he could no longer fully hide, a stillness in his body that hadn't been there before, his eyes moving toward me for just a fraction of a second before he caught himself. He asked, with forced casualness, what any of this had to do with a welfare check, and Detective Alvarez told him, with the same calm she had maintained throughout the entire conversation, that she was actually there as part of an active investigation into attempted poisoning, and that she had reason to believe he was the person responsible for administering harmful substances to his wife over an extended period of time. The room went silent in a way I don't think I will ever fully be able to describe, a silence that seemed to physically press against the walls. Daniel's face moved through several expressions in rapid succession, confusion, then something that looked almost like genuine fear, and finally, as he turned to look at me fully for the first time since the detectives arrived, a dawning, horrified realization that I was not the confused, weakening woman he had spent months believing me to be. He asked me, his voice cracking in a way I had genuinely never heard from him before, what I knew, what I had done, and Detective Ruiz stepped forward at that point to inform him of his rights. The familiar words I'd only ever heard on television suddenly playing out in my own living room. Beneath the same ceiling where Daniel had once made me tea every night with hands I had believed were gentle. He looked at me one final time as Detective Ruiz guided him toward the door, and in that look I saw something I had not expected to see. Not rage, not even fear exactly, but something closer to bewilderment. The bewilderment of a man who genuinely could not understand how the woman he believed he had successfully been deceiving for months had somehow seen through everything, had somehow turned his own carefully constructed plan back against him without him ever noticing. I did not say anything to him as he was led out of our house. Detective Alvarez had advised me beforehand that I didn't need to, that anything I wanted him to understand could wait, that my safety and the integrity of the case mattered more in that moment than any satisfaction I might gain from a final confrontation. I stood in the doorway and watched the patrol car pull away from the curb, watched the house I had lived in for 6 years grow quiet in a way it had never been quiet before, and I felt biscuit press against my leg, looking up at me with the same patient, uncomplicated loyalty he had offered every single day of this entire ordeal, completely unaware of everything that had just happened around him. Vanessa Whitfield was brought in for questioning 2 days later. Once investigators connected her texts, her social media posts from that hotel, and statement from co-workers who, once asked directly, admitted they had long suspected something was happening between her and Daniel. She was not charged criminally in connection with the poisoning itself, since the evidence showed Daniel had acted largely on his own in sourcing and administering the substances, but she faced significant professional fallout once the affair became public within their workplace, losing her position within weeks as word spread through an office that, I learned later, had been quietly aware of rumors for much longer than I had ever been. The legal process that followed took nearly a year to fully resolve, longer than I expected, filled with hearings and evidentiary reviews and the particular kind of exhausting patience the justice system demands from people who simply want their nightmare to end. Daniel ultimately accepted a plea agreement rather than risk a trial. Given the overwhelming nature of the evidence against him, a recorded confession of intent in his own messages, a documented pattern of administration, an insurance policy timeline that left no room for innocent explanation, he received a sentence that I will not detail here, only because I have chosen, for my own reasons, to keep certain specifics of his punishment private, separate from the parts of this story that belong to the world rather than just him. I want to tell you what happened to me after that, because I think the part of this story that matters most isn't actually the discovery or the swap, or even the night Daniel was let out of our house in handcuffs. It's what comes after the long, quiet work of rebuilding a life you believed was already built, brick by brick, from a foundation you suddenly understand was never as solid as you thought. I moved out of that house within 2 weeks of Daniel's arrest, staying first with Megan and her husband, and then eventually finding a small apartment of my own about 30 minutes from the school where I still teach second grade, in a building with a tiny balcony where Biscuit, who came with me without question, likes to lie in the sun every afternoon. The physical recovery took longer than I expected. Months of cumulative exposure to the Centrazol and the Vextramine had left my body more depleted than I realized while I was still living inside the daily fear of my situation. My doctor monitored my heart for several months afterward, just as a precaution, running tests that, thankfully, came back showing no lasting damage, though she told me that had this continued for another 6 months to a year without intervention, the outcome might have looked very different. I think about that more than I let on to the people around me. The narrow margin between the life I'm living now and the one Daniel had quietly mapped out for himself and Vanessa, a life that depended entirely on mine, ending in a way that looked accidental, natural, explainable. I see a therapist twice a month now, something I had never done before any of this happened, and she has helped me work through a question that followed me for a long time after Daniel's arrest, the same question that had haunted me during those months of swapping cups. Whether allowing harm to come to him, even unintentionally in some sense, even as a means of self-protection rather than revenge, made me someone I needed to make peace with in a different way than simply being his victim would have. My therapist has helped me understand that surviving a situation like this rarely comes with clean moral edges, that the version of myself who sat on that bathroom floor, sealing a sample into a contact lens case, was a woman doing what she needed to do to stay alive, and that this kind of survival doesn't require the same kind of justification we might demand from someone acting out of malice rather than fear. Megan asks me sometimes whether I regret not going to the police the moment I found that first lab report, whether the additional weeks of risk, both to myself and inadvertently to Daniel, were worth whatever sense of control I felt during that time. I have thought about this more than almost anything else from that period, and the honest answer is that I don't fully know. Detective Alvarez told me, near the end of the legal process, that the additional evidence we gathered during those weeks, the recorded video of the swap itself, the messages between Daniel and Vanessa, the social media posts from that hotel, made the eventual prosecution far stronger than it likely would have been with only the initial lab report and an overheard phone call. Without that additional time, she said, there was a real possibility Daniel could have found a way to explain away enough of the early evidence to avoid serious consequences entirely, leaving me in an even more dangerous position than before. That knowledge helps me sit more easily with the choice I made, even if it doesn't erase every uncomfortable feeling that came with it. I have not spoken to Daniel since the day he was let out of our house, and I do not intend to. He has written to me twice from where he is now, serving his sentence, letters I have not opened, because Detective Alvarez and my therapist both gently encouraged me to consider what purpose reading them might serve beyond reopening wounds that are finally, slowly, beginning to close. I keep both letters in a drawer I rarely open, not because I'm holding on to some unresolved hope of understanding a side of things, but simply because I have not yet decided what to do with them, and some decisions I have learned are allowed to wait. People sometimes ask me, when they learn pieces of this story, how I managed to stay so controlled during those months, how I sat across from a man slowly poisoning me and managed to drink my tea, perform my exhaustion, and plan my escape all at the same time, without breaking. I don't have a satisfying answer for that question, except to say that fear, when it becomes specific enough, when it has a shape and a timeline and a name like the one printed on that brown bottle, stops paralyzing you the way vague fear does, and starts organizing you instead. I was terrified every single day of those 3 months. I was also somehow more clear-headed than I had ever been in my life, because clarity, it turns out, is sometimes the only thing fear leaves you with when it takes everything else away first. I think about that brown bottle sometimes, sitting in an evidence room somewhere now, the small, unremarkable object that quietly upended every assumption I had about the life I was living. I think about how easily it could have stayed hidden in the toe of that glove forever, how close I came to never opening that closet door, never noticing that strange look on Daniel's face through a half-open guest room door. I do not know what would have happened to me if that moment had never occurred, if I had continued drinking my tea every night without ever questioning the man pouring it. I prefer not to imagine that version of events too closely, except to say that I am profoundly, quietly grateful that the woman who stood in that hallway 3 months ago, frozen for 10 seconds watching her husband stare at a bottle with an expression she had never seen before, chose to trust the unease in her own chest rather than talk herself out of it. If there is anything I hope you take from this story, beyond simply the suspense of how it unfolded, it is this: trust the small, quiet feeling that tells you something is wrong, even when everything around you insists that nothing could possibly be wrong, even when the person making you doubt yourself is someone you have built years of trust with. I swapped our cups 3 months before any of this ended, and for those 3 months, my husband believed completely and without a single doubt that he was the one in control of what was happening inside our home. He never knew, until 2 police detectives stood in our living room, and the truth finally caught up with him, that the woman he thought he was slowly erasing had spent every single one of those nights writing herself back into the story, one small, careful decision at a time. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way through. If this kept you on the edge of your seat, let us know in the comments what parts shocked you the most, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story when it comes out. We'll see you in the next one.